Hello, good morning. My name's James Rostance, and this is the 414 Live this Tuesday morning for a special show because of everything that's going on right now, really. So, crisis communications is highly relevant right now, and there are many reasons why you need to make sure you and your company have your communications on point. And it's true that with one badly worded or thought out communication, you can do untold damage to your reputation. But in addition to that, as a B2B marketing professional, you probably just want to make sure that you get it right. So, live on the show today, I'm going to be speaking with Kate Hartley, who's an expert in crisis communications, and she's here to give some incredibly valuable advice. And it's also going to be your chance to have a live Q&A with a standout expert in the field who could really make the world of difference for how you and your company navigate through this pandemic. So, without further ado, please welcome, live from London, Kate Hartley. Kate, good morning.
Good morning, James. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
There we go. I thought, and hey, thank you so much for joining me. And I thought it was quite fitting right then that I had a crisis of my own with the technology, getting us on air. It's almost as
something always changes on the day, doesn't it?
Seriously, there's always a subtle nuance to the show, which is fitting. And all the times I'd like for it to not go wrong, where it goes wrong on the day when we're talking about things going wrong. Okay, right. Well, hey, if there was ever a person to help dig me out of this hole and to help through this, you specialise in helping people through and companies through, right? Difficult situations. Yes,
I do. So I co-founded a company called Pulpio, which is a crisis simulation business, and we work with brands and agencies to help them navigate their way through a crisis by using simulation technology. But I've been doing it for years. I've had about 20, I would say 25 years. It's probably nearer 30, I think now, in PR agencies, specialising in crisis communications for about the last 10 years. And I've also written a book looking at how people behave in a crisis called Communicate in a Crisis.
Nice. And so normally you're dealing with, companies who have got... crisis. What's the correct plural of crisis?
Crises, I think.
It is crisis. I was trying to get
crises.
Okay,
yeah.
So on a day-to-day basis, what sort of issues do you normally deal with?
We deal with all sorts of issues for all sorts of companies and across the world. In mostly kind of big corporates in all sorts of sectors, from oil and gas to retail to FMCG to financial services, all across the range, really. But we're normally helping companies prepare for a crisis where there may be some element of fault or attributed fault to that company. So the company might have done something wrong, or somebody within the company has done something wrong. For example, we've been doing a lot of work with things like the Me Too movement to help companies kind of really get ahead of that and make sure that they have the right culture in place to those kind of things don't happen. But also they might be looking at things like what happens if an employee goes rogue, what happens if their supply chain is contaminated in some way, those kind of issues where there is some sort of blame. I think what's really interesting in this issue is that, of course, no company is to blame for what's happening to them right now. This is a global pandemic and a very, very different situation than perhaps we're used to preparing for.
With that said, so the reason why I really wanted to get you on the show today was to give some solid expert guidance on how companies could, or can and should navigate through this all in as best a way as possible to not mess things up, which I think is a very down-to-earth way of saying it, but also how to get through it successfully, ultimately. So the first point I wanted to talk with you about is, when we're speaking, you mentioned about the importance of empathy and how that's really a driving factor in how individuals and companies should be approaching their communications right now. So could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, of course. I think empathy is really important in a crisis situation, and I think it's a word that's actually pretty overused quite often. People talk about empathy in a very sort of, we need to show empathy. But sometimes they forget that in order to show empathy, they have to have empathy. And empathy really means putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, imagining what their experience is like going through that crisis. And I think what we see with companies very often in a crisis situation is that they'll think about what they want to say in the crisis. They won't necessarily think about what people want to hear or what people need to hear. But if you put people at the heart of your crisis communications, which may sound obvious, but it's not that often done actually, then you won't go far wrong. So what is it that people need to hear from you as a business? Who needs to hear it? What do they need to hear? And how can you deliver that message in a way that's effective and will be heard? So instead of thinking, what do I want to say? You think, what do people need to hear? And I think that if you start there, then that's a pretty good place to start.
Nice. And with them, following on from what people need to hear, what would you give us as a guidance as for a type of style for how to actually write or speak? No, let me repose that question. Does the way that you communicate, should it be the same across all mediums? So if one of your executives is on TV or your posts online through social media, should they not change in any way? Or do you adapt these for the different channels that you'll be using?
I'm so sorry, James. I lost you there for a second, so my apologies for that. Could you? We're talking about a language and what to say.
Yes, indeed, yes. So my question was, should companies and individuals adapt what they're saying and how they're saying it, depending on which channel that they're using, or do their communications need to be completely unified across all channels?
I think they should be unified across channels. I think if, again, going back to the empathy thing, if you think about what people need to hear, then the core message should be unified across all your channels. But perhaps the way you deliver that message might change slightly. So if you're talking to somebody on their Facebook page, for example, yes, that's going to be quite a different tone to if you're talking to somebody on a corporate email. And I don't know about the viewers and listeners, but I've had an awful lot of emails from companies that, frankly, I've never heard of, telling me what their COVID plans are. And I don't really care about some of them. Some of them you do, if they're a company you use very often. But I think people are using this almost as a reason to reach out to people over email, which I think is inappropriate. And actually what you need to know from a company is how their response impacts you as a consumer, or as a business that operates with that company. So again, I think it's just thinking what's the appropriate thing to say and then looking at the appropriate channel on which to say it. Nice.
Yes. Well, one of the emails I had yesterday was one that I'd never thought of, but apparently Hewlett-Packard, who provide my monthly printer subscriptions, are taking hygiene in the factory very seriously. So
very important that you know that, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah. What ones have you had actually that you've never thought that you needed to hear from them, but all of a sudden they popped up?
From all sorts of companies. There was quite an interesting one the other day. Actually, I had an email from an airline offering discounts in its sale if you were to buy tickets before the 31st of March, which I thought was hugely inappropriate at the moment, seeing as there's a global travel ban. But so there are some really odd things coming through. I think some of them are probably companies who just are not thinking very clearly about what they should be doing or what's appropriate at the moment. I've had all sorts of things from companies, honestly, that I've never in the past used. A talent agency I've never used. I'm in B2B marketing. I've never used a talent agency in my life. Talking to you about how their preparations are going for COVID, and it's bonkers, some of it really. Some of it is really useful though. I mean, my local pub saying that although they're closing, they will be doing takeaways. Now that's a useful thing to know. It's useful to know about your local shops. There are some amazing things coming out on social media on some of these groups, for example, like the mutual aid group, which I'm a part of in my local area. So there are some really good things coming out as well. So not all communication is poor, but I think some of it could be better thought through.
Which links kind of nicely to my next question, because hearing from printer companies, it made me smile. But on the subject of humour, it's a tricky one. What is your advice and guidance on when, how, or even to use humour? in your communications right now with everything that's going on?
I think right now there is honestly no place for it. I think people are sharing funny stuff on social media and memes and so on, and that's up to them. That's up to individuals to do. But as a company, I think right now there's no place for humour. This is not a funny thing that we're going through. This is life and death. And I just don't think there's a place for it right now. I really don't. It could be hugely inappropriate. You've got to stick to your own tone and your own values in this situation. But you've got to realise also that it's a very, very serious situation. These are serious times that we're living through. There's very clear guidance from government on what we should be doing. Of course, people want a bit of light relief, but I don't think they want it at the moment in brands in response to this crisis. They might want it somewhere else, but not from a company.
I like that. So individuals, you can in the right situation.
Of course.
Would that be more on a personal basis as well? So what if you're a public figure? Where does the use of humour play there? Because that seems a little bit of a grey area. Or does it depend on what sort of a public figure you are, maybe?
I think it depends. I mean, if you're a comedian, then probably it's appropriate to use humour. That's fine. But if you're a politician, absolutely not. If you're trying to give out a serious message, if you're trying to lighten the mood and giving people a bit of light relief, we can't. There's only a certain amount of this stuff we can listen to. Then I think that's fair enough. I think the key is sticking to who you are as an individual, as a brand, as a corporate, whatever you are, and sticking to your own values, and not kind of trying to suddenly introduce humour as a way of communicating in what is a really serious crisis.
Nice. Okay, then, well, misinformation is another one which is a big thing as part of all of this.
Yeah.
Could you talk us through how to deal with misinformation and what it involves?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research actually to show that we share, misinformation gets shared more quickly and more widely than the truth very often, usually because it's misinformation is often put out by people who are deliberately trying to confuse the public just as a kind of mischief thing, and it spreads very quickly because quite often the headlines are more compelling than the true headlines, and people don't have a lot of trust in governments, media, big organisations anymore, and they do trust individuals. So when they see misinformation going around their news feeds, they will very often believe it because it's come from a friend. I've seen some posts, for example, recently talking about ways that you can kill the COVID virus by gargling with salt water. I mean, of course that's not true. I mean, that might help you if you've got a sore throat, but I'm guessing that scientifically that there's really nothing to that particular piece of misinformation. And I've seen it in my news feeds from friends who frankly should know better. But those are the kind of things that spread around, and people think they're being helpful, so they're spreading this stuff around. In terms of a company, I think it's all about trust. If you can build trust with your audiences and set yourself up as the trusted voice of authority in a crisis, then people will come to you for information, and then you close down any need to spread misinformation. And from a company point of view, there might be instances, for example, if you're, if there's a hygiene issue, or if you're a company that's producing food, there might be rumours that start about you. They might be caused by, malicious, somebody, an employee or something. You just need to stay on top of that stuff and make sure that you correct any misinformation and only talk the truth, and that you build trust with your consumers or your customers so that they will believe what you're saying to them.
Right. I was just going to ask then, how should you deal with that? But then, you've...
monitor it. Keep on top of everything that's being said about you.
And deal with it quickly.
Quickly.
Have there been any examples like that you've noticed or currently where something's happened and that maybe has been the result of an employee saying something that wasn't completely right, or a case where members of the public have said something and actually the real story was something different? Are there any examples that you can think of right now?
I think it's too soon actually I don't in this particular crisis, but there are issues. So there are issues where we don't necessarily know what the facts were. So the stockpiling rumours, for example, there were rumours that we were going to run out of food, so everybody started stockpiling, and that was a terrible consequence of something that really wasn't true. Those kind of things are problematic. So again, if you're a retailer, you really need to be putting that message out that there is enough food, and it's customer behaviour that is causing the problem. So those kind of issues are really important to stay on top of. In London, there were rumours of a lockdown last week, which again created this absolute mass panic buying. Of course, that lockdown has come into effect now, but at the time, it just made for absolute mayhem. And I think rumours can be very, very dangerous in these situations.
And I guess the people ultimately responsible for that are those at the top. Could we talk next about leadership then, and the importance of strong leadership? Because you've got some very particular thoughts and views on that. Could you share those? Yeah,
of course. I think leadership in any crisis situation is absolutely critical. Obviously, right from the top, from government, but also down to company level. If you think what you're dealing with, we're all in a state of heightened anxiety. Nobody's quite sure what's going to happen next. And people need to look to somebody to guide them. Everybody needs that. And as a leader of a business, your employees are really going to look to you for guidance, and on very specific things as well. So both in terms of setting out what the company position is and how the company is going to look after its employees, for example, but both, with the detail of that. What does that mean? What does that mean if you're an employee who has an elderly relative or a child who's sick at home and you have to take time off work to look after them? Will you be financially looked after? Those kind of things. They need very, very clear leadership and guidance. And I work with an amazing man called Jonathan Hemus, who works for a crisis consultancy called Insignia. And he always talks about setting the strategic intent of the crisis right at the beginning. So that is the real role of a leader in a crisis. So instead of just thinking, how do we get through the next week? How do we stay open? How do we survive? You want to think about, when this crisis is over, what do you want people to look back at you and see that you did, that you achieved? What is the intent that you have through that crisis? And that will then inform everything you do and all the ways you communicate with people.
I really like that, of thinking months in advance, not just for the immediate. In fact, yes, the case of Wetherspoons for me really springs up there, because whilst they were maybe thinking about squeezing in an extra few days trading, they, I would imagine, have done considerable damage to their brand, and particularly for the chairman, for them having made that very short-term grab, but long-term, that's potentially really damaged them, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if your intent in this crisis might be that you need to keep your customers and your employees safe, for example, then clearly opening your pubs is not going to do that. So that to me seemed to be very much putting profits over the safety of people. And if you want an empathetic response in a crisis, then you need to put your people first. That's what it's absolutely all about. There's been quite a lot of backlash this morning as well against Sports Direct for saying that they're going to stay open because they're providing an essential service. Now, on the one hand, you do want people to keep fit and healthy, of course, and if your values is to keep the nation healthy, then you could argue that people need equipment to be able to do that. But there must be other ways of doing it. I think just to insist that all your employees come into your shops and keep them open is probably not the way to do it.
And also, I think people can see through that, though, as well. In fact, I've had a brief look. I don't really do Twitter, but I must sound like an idiot now, referencing Twitter as a solid journalistic source. But all right, speaking for myself, I mean, I can see through it that he's just looking for an excuse for keeping the doors open that little bit longer. Because it's not essential. And actually, I was looking last night at home gym equipment, because we're probably going to be locked down for quite a while. And the largest gym equipment supplier in the country, they've got a great big statement saying that as of yesterday, they were closed and they would be online orders only. Sorry about that. But they've got, they said that they have to put their customers and workers first.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And of course, not everybody can do online orders, but perhaps you could phone in orders, for example, or there must be other ways of doing it. And there might be other initiatives if you really genuinely wanted to put the health of the nation front and foremost, and that you genuinely believe that that's why you should keep your stores open. Perhaps there would be other initiatives that you could take that would make people believe you. I think, as you say, people are very cynical about the reasons for that happening, and I don't think it's had it may have been a genuine intention. I don't know, but the perception is that it's a cynical move. I think that's, at the moment, that's what matters.
Yes, and I do think that's. How about yourself? That's the way that certainly public figures and particularly brands and companies act right now will be remembered.
I think it really will. I heard a historian on the radio recently who said he thinks that we're going to look back at this period, and this is going to be a really dividing period in human history, before Corona and after Corona. And that was that really hit me, that phrase. And I think if people want to really survive in a post-Corona era, they need to look at how they're behaving right now.
I like that. Well, the next thing I wanted to talk about is, in fact, this links on quite nicely to the previous one, which is anger of the mob. Because goodness knows, social media has changed the landscape on that, and how people act differently online than they do in person. But yeah, what is your take?
What's going on?
Handling with and taking it and factoring in the quote unquote anger of the mob. Yeah.
I talk a lot about outrage, and I wrote a lot about outrage in my book and did a lot of research in it. And I think there are a number of reasons why we're all so, outraged and angry and have this kind of mob mentality. And I think it comes down to trust. And also, it's one of the downsides of social media. There's a lot of amazing stuff going on social media, and I think social media on the whole is a real force for good, but there are some downsides. And we talk about something called the outrage cycle, which is that somebody posts something on social media, a group of people attack that brand or that organisation for saying it, and then you wait long enough, and then another group appears who attack the first group, and then it all kind of implodes. And what you end up with is very polarised debate. So we see it in politics, for example. We saw it through Brexit. We see it in political elections in America and the UK, all over Europe, where there are extremes of opinion on all sides. And really, there's not much room for that kind of rational debate in the middle. In a crisis situation, of course, that can become heightened because you add anxiety into that mix as well. People are frightened. And when they're frightened, they retreat into kind of extremes. So I think people are angry, and also when they're frightened, they start to attribute blame. And I don't think we've quite reached there yet with COVID, but I think it will come. We start to attribute blame to people. So if you see people stockpiling the supermarket, there's the kind of vigilante groups who are naming and shaming and posting, pictures of them on social media, for example. So you get this kind of mob mentality. And it's partly about survival. As a species, we survive being part of a group. So we have that slightly kind of mob mentality built into us, if you like.
Yes, it's a tough one to work out. So, how should a brand or a company deal with that then, if perhaps they're on the receiving end of an instance of a mob attack?
I think you need to look at the reasons for that attack. So, if it is because you've genuinely done something wrong, then you need to move really quickly to put it right. So there was an instance of I was talking to a colleague of mine about a small shop in her area which had been selling loo rolls, I think, for £9 a roll or something yes. Really awful, profiteering basically out of this crisis. And so there was a big move to boycott that particular shop and to spread the word that they were doing a really awful thing and telling all their neighbours don't shop there. And clearly, in a situation like that, if the brand has done, or the organisation has done something like that, then they need to put that right, and then that kind of mob feeling will die back. If it is a perception thing, and it is not actually something that the company has done, so they don't have the opportunity to put anything right, then I think really you have to manage it. The first is to understand, again, it goes back to empathy. Why are people feeling like that? Is it because they're frightened? They've gone into fight or flight mode, and this is the kind of fight response to the crisis. Is there anything you can do to reassure people and to calm them down? And then ultimately, if people are just being abusive for no good reason, then you have to shut down those conversations online where you can.
And how do you shut down those conversations online, though?
Well, interestingly, quite often, if you set the rules of your social media pages very clearly, then sometimes the community will help you do that, actually, because they don't. A lot of people, will not want that element of outrage in their Facebook page or group or community group. And I've seen instances of this in some of the local response groups that I've been looking at, where people are bringing politics in, for example, or they're starting to attribute blame in the way that we typically see in a crisis, and other people are coming in and saying there's no room for that to happen here. This is a community where we just talk about the positive impact that we can have on our neighbours and keeping people healthy. And so I think that's really important. If you set the tone of your group clearly and upfront, then your community will help you shut those conversations down.
Right. I really like that as a strategy moving forward. But what if a company hasn't got that in place now?
I mean, there are practical things you can do. If you can tell somebody that you're going to mute them or delete the post. You can ask somebody to change the way they speak. If they're just doing it to be difficult, then I think there's generally a kind of 3 strikes and you're out rule is quite good. You can respond to somebody 3 times, and if they still don't respond in a positive way, you either hide what they're saying or you delete them. And of course, if they're doing something that's illegal or whatever, then of course you can report them. But I think on the whole, you can try and manage your community to manage itself where possible anyway.
I think that's awesome advice. At this point, I should say hello to anyone who's just joining us on the show. We're live here this morning, the 414 Live. Myself, James Ross-Dance, with Kate Hartley, a standout expert in crisis communications, whose skills and expertise is very much, I think, needed right now for a lot of companies. Not just in case you have messed up, I really hope you haven't, but to keep you on the straight and narrow, really, and to make sure that you don't end up in a situation where your brand and reputation is damaged in some way. So, Kate, what I'd like to do right now, we've got some questions to go to. It's all right if I fire these away to you?
Yeah, of course, go for it. Yep.
Let's do this. All right. So, John Wood. John, good morning. John asks, how do you strike a balance in both your internal and external communications around serious messages and humour and levity? That's a good word. To alleviate the potential overwhelming negativity. So, I guess touching on what we were talking about earlier on humour, but his exact question is, how do you strike that balance between internal and external communications around the seriousness of your message?
Well, I think there's sort of 2 points in there, aren't there? I'll take the internal and external first. Mm-hmm. I think the important thing to remember is that almost all your internal communications will now be leaked externally at some point by somebody. So I think that your core message should always be the same when you're talking, whether you're talking to your internal audiences or your external audiences. But of course, what employees need to hear from you is going to be different from what customers need to hear from you. Your employees are going to think more about their safety, their health, the health and safety of their families, their friends, and you need to address those issues with them. For your customers, they might be more worried about things like, are their supply chains going to be impacted? Are they going to get paid on time? Those kind of issues. So the tone and the core messages should be the same, but perhaps the detail is slightly different. On the issue of levity and humour, I think as I said earlier, I would avoid it as an organisation. I think you should allow your employees to be, have as much fun as they want to have and laugh. God, we all need a laugh at the moment, don't we? Something. But you're probably not, the company is probably not the one to deliver that. You want to deliver a serious message. However, you could create spaces for your companies to have fun. So we're doing a virtual drinks, for example, on Thursday with my team, so that we're all getting together and just have a little bit of light relief. We're not going to talk about work. We're just going to have fun, maybe a couple of glasses of wine together on video. So there are things you can do to bring some levity, which is a great word, to the situation, and to pull people together and find things that bind them together. But in terms of the messaging around COVID, I think you just need to stick to being pretty serious.
Sage advice. There we go. Communicating with employees was another one that I did want to cover with you. So as you say right there, that's a really good point. That's businesses from now on should always take that any internal comms will be leaked.
Yeah. We see that in most crisis situations. Actually, at some point, somebody will say, I've got a friend who, and they've just told me that their company's told them this, or look at this is the message that I just got from my employer that goes out into a private group and then gets leaked. I think you always assume that your internal comms will be leaked externally. It's a good thing to do, just assume it anyway. So never say anything that you wouldn't want to be heard publicly. Right,
like for example, the other one of the top 5 companies doing bad at the moment, Britannia Hotels with their. Did you see that that leaked internal comm, was it? Yeah, that was awful. In fact, that links to Jonathan Kendrick's question. Jonathan, good morning. He says, will businesses with poor crisis comms be remembered? Using Britannia as an example, maybe.
Yeah, I think they will. I think you get remembered. We tend to remember extreme times, don't we? Things that happened in extreme times, and you remember very good crisis responses, and you remember very poor crisis responses. And in the crisis comms industry, we always talk about a very good response as being Tylenol in the 1980s, when it was Tylenol, which is a paracetamol in the US, basically, or the brand name for paracetamol in the US, was in trouble because they had a number of paracetamol bottles that had been tampered with, and they'd been injected with a substance that actually killed 7 people in Chicago. And they had a huge J&J, which is the parent company, had this incredible response where they said, we're going to take all the bottles of Tylenol off the shelves. They had the strategic intent. We don't want anyone to die from taking Tylenol again. And everyone said they couldn't do it. It's impossible to take every single bottle of medicine off every single shelf and every single pharmacy across the US, but they did it at huge cost to themselves. But they managed to do it, and they kept the strategic intent, which was nobody died from taking Tylenol as a result. And the thing I think was really interesting was the recovery after they'd done that huge product recall. The recovery plan got rid of all of their normal marketing, and they said, we are going to create a tamper-proof bottle that means that nobody will ever have to go through this again. And that's how we got the tamper-proof bottles that we have now, and that was all because of that Tylenol crisis. And as a result, Tylenol is still operational. It lost a lot of money, but it's still in business. So I think you remember the very good responses as well as the very, very poor ones. And I think that's really important to remember.
That's a great story. I did not know that. About what that
it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an amazing response.
And in fact, on the positive side, I do think one of the ones, obviously, that'll get remembered with this will be and I can never get the acronym completely right, the people that own Louis Vuitton, where they jumped in straight away.
To make hand sanitizer.
Yeah, within 24 hours. That struck me as coming from strong, good leadership at the top.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they were the first to do it, I think, weren't there? And there are a number of others who've jumped on that too. I think there are a couple of gin distilleries. I think Diageo has announced that they're also doing the same thing. Some really amazing responses coming from brands who are seeing what the need is. I also saw that Premier Inn had offered hotel beds to hospitals. That the Intercontinental Group is working with the Mayor of London to provide beds to rough sleepers so that they can effectively self-isolate and because of course they don't have access to soap and water and those kind of things that we all take for granted. So there are some incredible responses from companies who are realizing that their hotels, for example, have huge capacity at the moment, so why wouldn't they go in and try and help where they can? But it takes, as you said, strong leadership to do that, and a really clear vision actually, and great values too.
I must admit, I do like hearing of those stories when companies have just stepped up and just done
me too.
great things. Brewdog, that's the British manufacturer. That's I think that they jumped in really quickly as well in making the sanitizer. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, hey, I guess I've got one last point for us to cover, and that is the big question of selling and when to sell, because at the moment it does seem that everyone has paused their sales and marketing endeavours, and that does feel like the right thing to do. But when do you maybe change that, or how do you handle it? Selling, when to sell. Could you give some guidance on that?
Yeah, I think it's all about context. Context is everything at the moment. If you're selling something that people need in this environment, then it's absolutely right that you should continue to sell it so that people still have access to the services or products that you have. If you are selling, well, as I mentioned earlier on, I had this email from an airline selling me air tickets at a discount until 31st of March. Well, clearly that's not appropriate. It is not appropriate that you should be encouraging people to travel. I had a train booked with the train line and to go up to see my in-laws, and obviously we couldn't use those tickets. And the train line won't refund money unless you rebook for travel within 12 weeks. Well, we're probably not going to be travelling anywhere within 12 weeks. Again, that's not an appropriate thing to do, in my opinion. So I think about what is appropriate right now and only sell what is, within the context of what's going on at the moment. Is your service essential? Should you be marketing it? Should people be spending their money on it? And are you doing everything you can to keep people safe? And if the answer to those things is no, then you shouldn't be selling.
Sure. With focusing specifically on B2B, though, this is a tricky one because B2B industry is typically behind B2C, so people need B2C products, but then B2B is fueling that. So I know there'd be a lot of people on LinkedIn who do everything from security systems to promotional merchandise. What do those guys do right now?
Well, again, I think it's context. So if you're selling something that relates to events, then it's an incredibly tough time. That's the first thing to say for all companies, especially those who can't sell at the moment. It's incredibly difficult, and I feel desperately for companies that can't. But I think you've got to look at the lens. So security companies, absolutely. We've heard all sorts of things, that there are all sorts of rumours that there will be a surge in phishing attacks, for example, with everybody working from home. People desperately need security systems so they can carry on functioning as a business. And a lot of things, of course, will continue to function. We're not shutting absolutely everything down. We still need B2B services. We still need banks. We still need security systems. We still need IT. There's things that we need in order to function and to keep the economy going. So those things are important. So I definitely don't think that we should stop. I just think we should look at what is appropriate and sell the things that people actually need and want to buy right now.
Okay, and if it's not then urgent to how do you describe it, to not be promoting, is that really the message that you'd like to get? So unless it's needed, to not be promoting for the immediate future. Is that about
I think there's no point in promoting something that people can't go out and buy. If we're supposed to be limiting ourselves to going to the shops twice a week and only going out once a day to exercise, then probably having a big promotion on clothing, for example, is not going to be appropriate. Or on, on travel, or something that's not actually going to happen right now. So I think it's just a question of looking at it through the lens of COVID and what is right. We are seeing a lot of companies pivoting at the moment, which is a word I think we're going to hear a lot of in the coming weeks and months. So where they perhaps would have focused on getting people together in a restaurant, for example, now you're much more likely to look at perhaps having social gatherings that are virtual and done by video. So just people looking at changing their messaging to fit with what's going on right now and how people are living their lives right now.
Perfect. Okay, and I guess in wrapping this up then, what would be the 3 key takeaways that you'd like to have viewers and listeners to take from this for them to be able to move forward and to do the right thing, really, with communications right now?
I think clarity of communications is incredibly important. Be absolutely clear to your employees and your customers about what you're doing. Put them first and foremost of your communication. So that's having really strong empathy. Think about what they need. And the third, I would say, is clear leadership. Have a really, really clear idea of what you want to achieve as a result of this and what you want to be at the end of all this.
Perfect. Well, Kate, thank you ever so much for joining me on the show.
It's been a pleasure.
Today. It's been really valuable and really good. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Yes. And if you've enjoyed watching, then please do subscribe to the show. You can go to the 414.net for all subscription options, as well as watch previous episodes. So the 414 every week for you as a B2B marketer, whether you're in-house at an agency or working in-house, or indeed if you're an SME business owner who takes an active interest in your company's sales and marketing. So there we go. This has been the 414. I'm James Ross Dance, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.